In March 2004, a new steakhouse in downtown Philadelphia put a $100 cheesesteak on its menu. Kobe beef, shaved black truffles, butter-poached Maine lobster tail, a chilled split of champagne on the side. In a city where the same sandwich sells for $4 on almost every corner. It worked. It is still working. The man who put it there was called Howard Ween, and he was not being clever. He was frightened. Ween had walked away from a corporate job managing billions in food and beverage revenue to open one small room, and he knew the arithmetic. More than a quarter of restaurants close within 12 months. 60% are gone within 3 years. In Jonah Berger's flat phrase, the thing restaurants are best at is going out of business. Wine had no advertising budget worth the name. He needed strangers to talk. Everyone knows word of mouth sells things. Nobody can explain why some things get talked about and almost nothing else does. So the question sat there, unanswered and worth billions. And the man who would eventually answer it was, at that moment, sitting in a windowless attic with a pair of scissors. Jonah Berger grew up in a house with no sweets and no television. When his parents gave rewards, the rewards were educational. One holiday season, he was given a book of logic puzzles and worked through it obsessively for months. He went to college meaning to become an environmental engineer, having already studied how a stream's shape depends on the land draining into it. Then, sitting in a hard science class, he caught himself doing something else. He liked watching people. When he did watch television, he enjoyed the commercials more than the programs. And he began to wonder whether the instruments that measured watersheds could be pointed at human beings instead. Therefore, he switched. Psychology, sociology, how people see themselves and others. And a few years in, a package arrived from his grandmother. She had clipped out a review of a new book she thought he might like. It was called The Tipping Point. He read it, then read everything like it he could find. And the more he read, the worse one specific frustration got. Because the ideas in those books were, in his own word, mainly descriptive. They named the phenomenon beautifully. They did not explain it. Some things catch on. Why? What is the human behavior underneath? Nobody had the answer. Nobody had even collected the data. Which opens a harder question, the one this story turns on. If it isn't luck, is it the message, or is it the messenger? Everyone in marketing already knew the answer to that one. That was the problem. Years later, teaching, Berger started putting a pop quiz to his students and to rooms full of executives. One question: what percentage of word of mouth happens online? Social media, blogs, email, chat rooms? Hundreds answered. The average guess was around 50%. Some said 70%. The actual number is 7%. Not 47%. Not 27%. 7%. An entire industry had aimed its budget at 7% of the conversation, and nobody in any of those rooms had noticed. Therefore, consider what a publisher once did to Berger. Publishers send him free books, hoping he will set them for his students. One of them sent 2 copies of the same book with a note. Here is a second for a colleague who might be interested. That publisher was not being generous. That publisher was using him as a searchlight, letting him sweep his own network and find the one person the book actually fitted. Which is why a recommendation from an ordinary friend outperforms advertising by at least 10 times. So Berger decided to stop reading stories about things catching on and start counting them. His office at Stanford was a high-walled cubicle in the windowless attic of a concrete building shared by 60 graduate students. The one real perk was a keycard. Late at night, he took the elevator down to the closed library with his trusty scissors, found the stack of newspapers, and cut out the day's most emailed list. Then it got strange. 2,000 miles away in Utah, a man called Tom Dixon was breaking things. Dixon graduated in engineering in 1971 into a job market with nothing for him. The only post he could find was at a company making intrauterine devices, work that sat badly with his Mormon faith, so he left. He liked baking bread, noticed there were no good cheap home grinders for milling flour, and built one out of a $10 vacuum motor. It ground finer flour more cheaply than anything on the market. The grinder became a business. The business became blenders. In 1999, he founded BlendTech. His blenders were extraordinary, and almost nobody knew they existed. So every single day, in his own factory, Dixon would cram 2x2 boards into a blender and switch it on, just to see what broke first. That is the whole of it. A man in a warehouse, destroying his own product, for an audience of nobody. Back in the attic, Berger's clippings became a spreadsheet, and the spreadsheet was useless. One day the most emailed pieces were spouses too tired to talk, and Disney gowns for larger women. Days later, an economist studying autism, and birdwatchers who carry laser pointers. What does a tired marriage have to do with a Disney gown? Then a colleague, Catherine Milkman, suggested the obvious thing he had not done: automate it. They built a crawler that read the front page of the New York Times every 15 minutes for 6 months. Almost 7,000 articles, and against each one, whether it had made the most emailed list. Here is the plan he carried into that data. If certain topics travel and others don't, then the answer is topic, and the answer is easy. Education beats sports. Health beat politics. All true and all worthless, because saying that dining pieces travel further than sports pieces explains nothing about why. He had described the weather. He had not found the physics. So he tried again, and hired a small army of research assistants to score every article on the two things anyone would guess: how interesting it was, and how useful. How Google tracks flew through search terms. Interesting. A change in a Broadway cast? Not. How to protect your credit score? Useful. The obituary of an obscure opera singer? Not. Both worked. Interesting pieces were 25% more likely to make the list. Useful ones, 30. And one section refused to behave. Science. Science pieces carried almost no status and almost no practical use, and they beat politics, fashion, and business anyway. Somewhere in that same ocean of shared things sat an 86-year-old man in Oklahoma who has made exactly one video in his life, and 5 million people have watched it. Which brings us to October 2008, and a New York Times reporter called Denise Grady. Grady's viral hit that day was an article about fluid and gas dynamics. Schlieren photography, a bright light, precisely placed lenses, a curved mirror, a razor blade that blocks part of the beam. The technique had spent decades photographing shock waves around aircraft. An engineering professor turned it on something else. She had found it in the New England Journal of Medicine, buried under jargon about infectious aerosols and velocity maps. Above the jargon was a picture. It was a photograph of a cough. A human cough, made visible, hanging in the air. Thousands forwarded it within hours of publication. Berger's summary of why runs to 4 words. When we care, we share. Therefore, the answer was emotion, and he could prove it. The assistants went back through the archive and scored every article for one particular feeling: a new treatment for AIDS, a hockey goalie who kept playing through brain cancer, gorillas that appeared to grieve for their dead. Awe. Awe is a complex emotion and frequently involves a sense of surprise, and when they ran the numbers, awe boosted sharing. Awe-inspiring pieces were 30% more likely to make the list, however useless they were. He had it. Emotion drives sharing. Meanwhile, the industry outside his attic went on spending millions a year hunting for the special people it believed were doing the spreading. Then he ran sadness. Now slow down here, because this is the moment the whole thing turns over. Sadness is an emotion. Sadness is a strong emotion. Sadness is what every charity and every public health campaign on earth reaches for. First, on the assumption that if you make a person feel enough, that person will act. Sadness is what you would have bet the house on. Sad articles were 16% less likely to make the most emailed list. Less, not more. Less. It was never about how much people felt. It was about one particular word, and the word was not emotion. The word was arousal. Arousal is a state of activation and readiness for action. Your pulse rises, your palms sweat, your muscles tense, and you go alert to every sound. It is old machinery, built for catching food or fleeing predators, and it does not care whether you are delighted or furious. Awe activates, anger activates, anxiety activates, amusement activates. Sadness switches you off. Sad people put on soft clothes and curl up on a sofa. Arousal kindles the fire. But that meant every comfortable assumption underneath the whole business was standing on nothing. Take quality. Olivia and Rosalie are both fine names for a girl. Similar length, both ending in a vowel, both out of Latin. In 2010, there were almost 17,000 Olivias born in the United States. There were 492 Rosalies. Neither name is better, neither costs anything. Nobody has ever advertised either one. Take price. Everything on YouTube is free, and 50% of YouTube videos have fewer than 500 views. Take attention. In August 2004, at the Athens Olympics, a Canadian named Ron Bensimon stepped onto the 3-meter springboard, raised his arms to the crowd, and performed a full belly flop. He was not an Olympic diver. He was a professional streaker in a blue tutu and white polka dot tights, with the name of an internet casino across his chest. The story went round the world. They talked about the tutu. They talked about the Chinese divers who flubbed the next dive and lost the gold. They talked about how a stranger had walked into the Olympic Games. Yes, people talked about the stunt, but they didn't talk about the casino. It was, Berger says, like building a magnificent Trojan horse, but forgetting to put anything inside. And take quality one more time, because in 2011 a 13-year-old released a song critics dubbed the worst song ever. It was called Friday, and was watched 300 million times. Look at the daily searches for Rebecca Black that March, and you will see a spike, a flat week, another spike, 7 days apart, then 7 days again. The song was equally bad on every day of the week. But therefore what Berger had found was not a marketing trick. It was a physics, and physics fires in every direction. Dave Carroll was a working musician, good enough to make a living, not famous. Flying to a gig in Nebraska, his band had to check their guitars. As they waited to get off the plane at O'Hare, a woman cried out that the baggage handlers were throwing guitars across the tarmac. He begged a flight attendant for help. She sent him to the lead agent, who said it was not her responsibility. He landed in Omaha at midnight, opened the case at baggage claim, and found the guitar smashed. He spent 9 months asking United to repair it. United refused. He had missed a 24-hour claims window buried in the small type on his ticket. So he wrote a song about it. United Breaks Guitars went onto YouTube in 2009. In under 4 days it had 1.3 million views, and United's stock price fell 10% in the same 4 days, about $180 million. And that is where you have to sit for a moment, because the machinery is indifferent. It carries a photograph of a cough, and it carries a smashed guitar with exactly the same efficiency. Anger travels, anxiety travels, awe travels. Sadness does not. Which means the quietest, truest, saddest things, the ones that most need passing along, are precisely the ones that stay where they are. Nobody designed that. It is what the machine does. But in 2006, back in Utah, Tom Dixon hired a marketing director. George Wright's previous employer had an advertising budget larger than all of Blendtec's revenue. On one of his first days on the job, he noticed a pile of sawdust on the floor of the plant. No construction was going on anywhere in the building. He asked what it was. It was Tom, doing what Tom did every day. And Wright saw the thing Berger would spend a decade proving. The remarkable thing was already there. Nobody had made it visible. He did not need a better blender or a bigger budget. He needed a camera. Therefore, gather what the decade of data produced. 6 levers, every one a picture rather than a theory. $100 cheesesteak, because talking about it makes the talker look like a person who knows things. A song called Friday because the calendar reminds you once a week. Top of mind means tip of tongue. A photograph of a cough because when we care, we share. A mustache grown in November because a private cause worn on a face is built to show, built to grow. An old man and an ear of corn. News you can use. And a story with something hidden inside it because information travels under the guise of idle chatter. So Wright spent his entire budget, a $50 budget, on marbles, golf balls, a rake, and a white lab coat. He put Tom in the coat, put a blender in front of a camera, and asked him to do what he did every day anyway. 50 glass marbles. The solid kind, strong enough to survive a car driving over them. Slow churn 15 seconds. Then Tom lifted the lid and white smoke poured out. Glass dust. The marbles had become flour. 6 million views in the first week. Within 2 years, the videos had increased retail blender sales 700%. So make a remarkable video. That is the lesson. And the lesson is wrong. In the same period, Evian released Roller Babies, animated infants doing tricks on roller skates. Guinness World Records called it the most viewed online advertisement in history. And that year, Evian lost market share and sales dropped almost 25%. Everybody remembered the babies. Nobody remembered whose babies they were. Therefore, the thing you are selling has to sit inside the story, not stand beside it. An Egyptian dairy company called Panda made an advertisement in which a father and son walk past the cheese aisle. Can we get Panda cheese? Enough. Then a giant panda appears. It stares at them. Then, calmly, to soft music, it destroys the shop. Never say no to Panda. Try telling a friend that story without saying the word panda. You can't. That is the whole trick. And it works with no money at all. In 2007, sales were declining around 5% a year at Kit Kat, and Hershey would not pay to put the brand back on television. So Colleen Chorak, who had almost nothing to spend, looked instead at when people actually ate the things. On a break, with a hot drink. Kit Kat and coffee. Coffee and Kit Kat. That was the whole campaign, and within a year the brand had grown to $500 million. Now, Kit Kat and cantaloupe is just as alliterative. But nobody drinks cantaloupe 4 times a day, and that, not the wordplay, is why it worked. Which brings us back to an 86-year-old man in a kitchen. Ken Craig was born on an Oklahoma farm and has been eating corn since the 1920s. His daughter-in-law was cooking dinner and told him the corn needed shucking. "Let me show you a little trick," he said. 4 minutes an ear in the microwave. A kitchen knife, half an inch off the bottom. Then he took hold of the husk at the top, gave it 2 quick shakes, and out popped the ear of corn. Clean as a whistle. No silk. She filmed it the next day to send to her daughter teaching English in Korea. To this day, he has made only 1 YouTube video. Ever. No truffles, no lobster, no champagne, no budget whatsoever. One last thing, and it is the sharpest number in the book. 80% of manicurists in California are Vietnamese Americans. It started in 1975, in a tent city outside Sacramento, with 20 refugee women, an actress from Hitchcock's The Birds, and her long coral fingernails. Big forest fires aren't caused by big sparks,